CERN May 2021 discussion series. My name is Audrey Lopez and I'm an urban designer at MGS Architects here in Melbourne. I'm joined this evening by my fellow facilitator, Jan King, who's an urban planner and data analyst from SGS Economics and Planning, also in Melbourne.
Yeah, so before we begin, we would just like to first acknowledge the Bunurong, Bunurong, and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we are zooming in here today. We pay our respects to their land, their ancestors, and their elders, past, present, future.
And today's presentation is part of the monthly discussion series held by Cities and Environments Research Network, or CERN. For those of you who are first-time attendees of our event, CERN is a group of Filipino postgraduate scholars, PhDs, postdocs, and lecturers based in Australian universities with research interests in the Philippines at the junctures of planning, development, disaster education design, art, communication, and ecology.
So just a few housekeeping rules before we start. During the presentation, just make sure to mute your microphone to minimize any background noise and to turn your video off just to save on the bandwidth. Please share your questions on the Zoom Q&A function below. We will be opening up the floor to questions after the presentation, and we will try to answer as many of the possible questions at the end. And one more thing, you might have seen like the notification. We will be also recording this session, so please let us know if you'd like your audio or video to be omitted before we upload this publicly to our YouTube channel. Thank you.
And for this evening, I'm pleased to welcome Leandro Poco as our guest speaker. Leandro is a Philippine registered architect and environmental planner with over 15 years of combined planning and architectural practice experience in both Manila and Singapore. He completed his Master of Science in Space Syntax, Architecture and Cities degree at University College London, Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment. He previously completed his MA in Urban Design at NUS in 2008. He is also a partner with Leandro Poco and Associates Architects and has a keen interest in Metro Manila's urbanism. He believes that evidence-based planning and design are key in improving Metro Manila's dystopia and addressing her residents' discontents. His lecture today is titled Enclave Urbanism, the Spatial and Historical Configuration of Metro Manila's Privatized Exclusion and its Prospects for the Future. Leon, over to you.
Thanks, Audrey. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. First off, I'd like to thank the CERN team. When I saw the acronym CERN, I thought I was presenting to physicists in Switzerland. Hindi pala, but I'm glad to present to just an esteemed group of scholars down under. Now, I see a hello to a few of the familiar names that I see in the audience. I think maybe one thing that some might have already seen these slides, but I added a few more slides coming from my more recent research and practice output. Now, there are a few things that I'm not able to disclose because I have NDAs with some of my clients, but I'm inserting some case studies at the end that show how these studies could be realized for new projects or for actual conditions on the ground. So I'll start with the talk. This is a brief outline. After the introduction, I will be talking about what space syntax is and what are its key concepts. And the prime cut of the steak will be discussing the research findings about Metro Manila. And I'll be talking about prospects moving forward. And hopefully we'll have enough time for Q&A. So I'm Leandro Poco. I work as a partner for practice and design development with Poco Architects. We believe in working with our clients to co-create projects, not just for themselves, but for the broader public as well. So space syntax was developed by Bill Hillier and Julian Hanson of UCL in the late 70s and 80s. It was initially used to uncover the spatial causes of social decay and disorder within England's public housing estates. Obviously, estate residents were more economically disadvantaged, but the big question then was, why were most social housing estates full of gangs and crime? So at first, they thought that architecture design create segregated parts of defensible space that when uh, when in the end, when used by people, became territories for gangs and drug dealers. So I'm sure the next question is, what is space syntax? The heart of space syntax is how humans see and move through space. Because our eyes are forward-facing, we understand space as linear paths. And that is also how we move through space. Now, we interact with space and with other people in convex or enclosed spaces, or spaces that form hidden rooms or hidden outdoor spaces. From this, one can see how we experience architectural space depends on how it's configured. As this dictates the visibility, paths, and affordances, it allows people who enter and use a space. So this first diagram on the left is more configurationally open and affords more spatial options for views and movement. While the second diagram on the right shows more path dependency and limits the kind of sequence of movement and experience of space. This illustrates how a simple change in the layout of openings changes the corresponding characteristics of a space and influences a configuration's hierarchy and control, thereby affecting its use. So based on this, space can be represented as axial lines, drawn as the straightest, longest line that passes through open spaces in a city or a building. So each street or segment of a street, if it's curving, can be represented by axial lines. Each axial line represents a street or space, and each axial line is then counted as a node, which when grouped together, according to their connections, form a network that can be mathematically analyzed. I'm sure you've heard about data science and network science. So if you've seen articles on those topics, essentially, space syntax is spatially applied network and graph theory from mathematics. The analysis of the axial lines of the spatial network generates specific properties with different characteristics and uses. So the node of high closeness centrality in red means that the node is the closest to the most number of neighboring nodes. Because of this, it has the highest capacity to generate activity or traffic towards it, meaning it's easier to get to. That's why sometimes on a certain street corner, you will see 2 or 3 coffee shops like Starbucks, because that street corner happens to be the most central or highly integrated of the segments. Next is the node of high betweenness centrality, which is shown in blue. It means that the node is between the most number of neighboring nodes, and thus has the highest route choice value. This means that it has the highest capacity to generate through traffic as things flow through it, moving from one side to another in the network. A high betweenness centrality means that there's a higher chance that it will cause traffic through a space. So the best example I can cite here is for Southern Metro Manila. Going to Makati, you really only have 2 ways, 2 options. Either you go through Coastal Macapagal and EDSA, or through Skyway and SLEX. Then lastly, the node of high clustering coefficient, shown in green, means that the node is grouped close together with the most number of interconnected nodes. This creates co-location and shows a high density of activities and complementary or supplementary activities. This is why we get areas like Dangwa for flowers or Raon for electronics in Manila. Now, the centralities and the analyzed graph creates the centralities that the analyzed graph creates is then tested and measured with actual observations on site. By counting and measuring people and traffic and tracing their movement and their places of rest, we're able to understand how the spaces are used over time and how actual conditions are similar or deviated from in the analytical model. Through excuse me, repetitive research of different cities and urban cases, the Space Syntax Lab at UCL has arrived at a theory of natural movement, which states that pedestrian footfall or vehicular traffic tend to the most accessible segments or spaces of a network. Now, natural movement as a theory has been tested and falsified in other locations over the decades of research. In parts of London, the regression of movement or footfall counts and vehicular counts against the integration values of the network show very high correlations of up to 0.589 for pedestrian movement and 0.7 for vehicular movement. Now, in the world of social sciences, this correlation is pretty high. And while it's not super accurate, sometimes in planning and policy and design, all you really need is a model that can be prepared quickly, even if you do not have the complete traffic data or pedestrian counts, to be able to come up with a workable plan or design direction. In some cases, you may be able to create a model with 90% accuracy using big data collection methods, like what you see in smart cities, no? The smart city models. But this inevitably takes up more time, more technology, and in doing so, you may end up with a very specific model that you cannot use or work with in different cases where you have a tabula rasa. So space syntax's versatility and usability has an advantage over more sensor-driven and computationally intensive methods, and allows us to rapidly prototype and test ideas as part of the planning and design process. Now, the core of space syntax is the concept that how we interact with space influences our social behavior. These concepts are codified in the two Bibles of space syntax called The Social Logic of Space and Space is the Machine, both by Bill Hillier and Julian Hanson. For example, if you notice how our social networks form on Facebook, the people we know and have relationships with correlate with where we first meet them and eventually where we interact with them on a regular basis. Of course, this might have changed through social networking online, but fundamentally, the importance of place remains. Now, space syntax allows us to strip away all the layers of a city, the history, our sentimentality, the reputations, land values, branding, and look at the underlying spatial configuration that tends to drive human interaction. And by doing so, space syntax allows us to quantify and analyze the key mantra of real estate, which is location, location, location. And we're now able to apply this logic on the macro, city, regional scale, the meso, and the micro. Moving on to key concepts in space syntax. Because natural movement occurs, that we now know that natural movement happens. Businesses and transactions and all forms of social exchange naturally occur along accessible pathways. And this is what's called the formation of movement economies. This is why in organic parts of the city, you get shops lining up naturally along streets with high footfall in red. So all these little dots here are shop fronts. No? Of course, this also means that crime and similar antisocial behaviors could also probabilistically occur along streets with high footfall as well. And these are shown as the white hotspots. In London, research on social behavior has shown that even drug dealing occurs 1 to 2 turns away from a major high street or shopping street. And certain drug overdoses and crimes occur 1 to 2 turns away from that vending area. So this has changed policing strategy in the UK, with the Metropolitan Police now patrolling not just on the high street itself, but also on the surrounding streets with less shop fronts and less visibility. The next key concept of space syntax is the formation of the foreground and background networks. The active foreground network is usually more accessible, more urban, and more generative. Foreground networks naturally have higher traffic and have higher activity, and they're called generative because of their capacity to create co-presence and new interactions between people who pass through them. These are shown in the graphs in the red and warm gradients. So usually the foreground network is the one that's more urban. Okay. The passive background network is less accessible and more suburban and more conservative. Background networks are naturally quieter, have less activity, and are usually residential in use. Now, in certain portions of London's street network for residential areas, even without certain areas of the city are naturally quieter and more residential. And these are shown in graphs in the green. And so this is a graph showing Wakwak and the Valle Verde and San Juan district. So you'll see how EDSA is a part of the foreground network, and you can see all the gated villages in the cooler regions. And the last key concept of space syntax for this talk is the difference between order and structure. Now, order is usually imposed as a top-down and geometrically defined pattern. It is about getting conformance in behavior and appearance. As such, because they are top-down, people don't follow and comply. No? These rules are usually top-down and also not followed. This is apparent in how geometric grids and walkways are usually bypassed by people and manifested in desire lines through lawns. On the other hand, structure is inherent even in the most chaotic and disorderly contexts. So in Iran's ancient and tight city streets, certain centralities form and manifest as the structural cores of their cities. The interesting thing is, these cores usually correspond to the natural marketplaces or bazaars of these areas. So as professionals in the built environment, this is a unique dilemma because we inherently impose our will on the land without necessarily understanding, okay, these are the latent evidence and spatial characteristics of the space, of the network. I think this is a result of the difference between how an architect thinks versus how a planner thinks. Thinking architecturally is about imposition and enclosure, defining inside and outside, while thinking like a planner, on the other hand, prioritizes context and connection. Which leads me to my research on Metro Manila's spatial configuration, entitled Enclave Urbanism. As a backgrounder, for the few non-Filipinos or Manileños in the audience, as a backgrounder, modern-day Metro Manila is a dystopia of extremes: wealth, poverty, alongside each other, congested streets and public transport, and uncoordinated planning policy. Now, while local planners nostalgically bemoan Daniel Burnham's City Beautiful plan as the lost ideal, the Duterte government plans to relocate the capital away from Manila. Struggling for solutions, Duterte pushes to clear streets and open some of Manila's exclusive villages to public traffic. But to date, there's no published study about the potential effects of this nature. This leads to the study's research questions. First is, what spatial patterns occur in Metro Manila's history? Second, how did the unrealized Burnham plan impact Manila's development? Third, how is Metro Manila's current urban fabric configured? And fourth, what can be done to improve Metro Manila's spatial configuration? So this study adopts a layered framework for its literature review and methodology. Manila's history is joined with relevant global discourse on suburbs, gated communities, and private development, which are actually a common thread. No? Globally, suburbanization, privatization are given trends in most world cities, especially in the suburbs. These are then overlaid on the key space syntax concepts we discussed earlier, which is natural movement economies, dual network, and order and structure of spatial networks. Now, this slide is for the academics in the room, but also to show that space syntax is not necessarily just a piece of software, but it's really a method and a system of thinking to understand space and to test plans and designs. To define the scope and limitation of the project, this study focuses on Metro Manila's activated core within the green area, defined by C5 road, or circumferential 5. You see, this red area here is in a way is behaving like Metro Manila's activated core. It then zooms into the private enclaves shown by Google Street View ski map as voids in the spatial network. So you see these as voids because Google couldn't enter these villages or these areas because these are not publicly accessible, because these are part of the gated enclaves. So you'll see these later as patterns of inaccessibility in the fabric. Now, moving to the findings. The Spanish founded the walled city of Intramuros in 1571. It was to be a tropical reproduction of a European town. old map oriented from Manila Bay. That was the primary point of access and orientation because it always came from the sea. Notice also how Intramuros is drawn as the logical center of Manila with a defensive buffer of the Pasig River and Luneta around it. This is the imposed order on the city and surroundings. The popular interpretation is that by placing Intramuros in the center of the city, its guns are now able to aim at native settlements like a panopticon. And if there's social unrest in Binondo, the Spanish simply just have to fire warning shots across the river. Now, outside Intramuros, the Spanish founded mission churches or plazas or reducciones to convert the local populace and to reproduce Christian piety through the rhythms of church bells and rituals. As you can see, space is itself a device to replicate social behaviors. What Catholics do in Spain, we likewise do, probably with even more bravado and flavor and chaos in Manila. As shown in the 400-meter radius of analysis, these churches, or the white points, are located in locally integrated areas, which are warmer, and are therefore serving a more local populace that walk to church, as could have been expected from that time. Now, even though the Spanish saw Intramuros as the center of Manila, Binondo or Chinatown here rose as the integration core of Manila's spatial network. And you can see how warm this area is relative to the other parts. The irony of this is not lost on many Chinese Filipinos, especially since the legacy of discrimination and exclusion is still felt today. So the Sangli Chinese Filipinos were relocated by the Spanish from Arroceros, which is just outside of Intramuros, then eventually to the present Chinatown in Binondo. The marginalized by circumstance also become the most primarily positioned in the spatial network, allowing Binondo to become Manila's primary trading district, which it remains to be up to now. Outside of the CBDs, the most natural, highest land values will always be found in Binondo, despite the history and the circumstances of blight in that area. The historical record, Binondo's shopping street, Calle Escolta, takes its name from the Royal Escorts camped on it. But the historical record says that Escolta was actually the path that the Spanish Governor General took as he commuted from his residence in Malacanang into Intramuros and back. The governors did not want to live in the intrigue of Intramuros, so they stayed away because Escolta felt safe. And then because Escolta felt safe with all the royal escorts camped on it, on Callejon Soda, which is just a side street of Escolta, that street became patronized by colonists because they felt safe as they headed out of Intramuros and transacted with the locals. So Escolta could be called Spanish Manila's first secured shopping mall, with the royal escorts, the first blue guards. Outside of Manila, the Spanish grant control of land and labor to their preferred elite. While originally all land was controlled by the friars, through centuries of trade and interaction, these lands ended up directly controlled or owned by the colonist or local elite and chieftains. This system is called encomienda and becomes the backbone of colonial production. The Philippines is then transferred from Spain to the US in 1898, and under McKinley's policy of the US brings modern civilization to its shores, modern civilization. As part of this, renowned planner Daniel Burnham prepares his 1905 City Beautiful Master Plan for Manila and proposes a radial concentric grid that became the basis for our circumferential road network. Geometrically, the intention was to create a center focus at Rizal Park. Burnham assimilates the Spanish mission churches into a radial concentric grid and then defines the government center beside the walled city, which is supposed to be Rizal Park, the new capital. What happens next is similar to what happens to our church plazas. This government center ends up replicating values. So Burnham meant to unify Intramuros and Binondo along with the new civic core as the new center and the core of the city. The irony is, instead of this imposed order, Burnham inadvertently pushed integration away to the red areas as shown in the north and south of Pasig River. This manifests today in how usually empty and less vibrant Luneta and Intramuros is, and how for some time Binondo and San Nicolas were also decaying and blighted. All the action and energy of downtown Manila is very present in U-Belt to the north, through Avenida Rizal, Recto, and España, and U-Belt to the south, which is Taft Avenue and Ermita. Outside of Manila, the Americans attempt land reform to redistribute the encomiendas and prior lands to Filipinos. But these lands are bought by the same encomienda grantees, officially privatizing the estates. Burnham proposes generous parks and open spaces on Manila's edges, similar to the green belts and buffers defined by Ebenezer Howard in his Garden Cities. But these overlap with the private estates and are outside of Manila's plan and control. So from this, you can see that the story of the Burnham Plan is not just about the city beautiful, but also about its limitations. It foreshadows how government planners are not able to impose their political will and development controls on private estates, because ultimately land ownership and political power is modeled to begin with. What this shows is how, in the end, the best private developments in the Philippines are those that begin to take the roles of government for themselves through estate administration, development control, and homeowners associations. The 1945 map of Manila consolidates 46 years of American urban development. And you see, William Parsons lays the Burnham radial grid, but adapts it. So he rezones the riverside waterfronts along the Pasig River for industrial uses, and these are outlined in purple. This was vital because industry needed access to waterfronts for raw material and finished product deliveries for coolant, and unfortunately, waste discharge as well. So the large industrial blocks along the river effectively disconnects one side from the other. And you can see this in how the spatial graph picks up the north-south separation of Manila's integration course in red. This north-south separation leads to the disconnection of the urban fabric and turns the city's back against the river. So in a way, it foreshadows our existing urban condition where the edges of the Pasig River have become blighted and are now being proposed to be connected, or shall I say, disrupted by the proposed expressway on the river. But some nuance, no? Looking at the southern integration core here below, no? This warm concentration here. You will see that American-founded establishments, which are the dots in yellow, have the highest integration values in 1945. So this is the graph of integration values for all these little dots. These establishments are also physically segregated. So they're the most accessible, but these establishments are also the most physically segregated from the rest of the city by parks to the north and south, which is Harrison, and then by the Pasig River's creek. So this is Estero de Paco, which effectively cuts off this area from the eastern side. So it's cut off to the north by Pasig River and by Luneta and Intramuros. It's cut off to the south by Harrison Park, sorry, hindi pa pala Plaza. But what it now forms is a wall-less enclave, a highly connected local wall-less enclave, which emerges as Manila's premier address, its Bayfront district. The interesting thing is that's also where Manila's elite lived, worked, and played. Doesn't this remind you of our existing districts as well? Our own wall-less enclaves? Now, Manila is devastated after World War II as liberation forces shelled the resolute Japanese. This hastens Manila's suburbanization into its adjacent private estates, and Quezon City with south and west triangle forming. And instead of Burnham's parks and open spaces, we see the hacienda edges closest to Manila become suburban spillover for the city. By 1967, Manila grows to the edge defined by Circumferential Road 4, named Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, or EDSA. Signaling decentralization, EDSA spatial integration values in 1967 are already much higher than Manila's old core. From this, one can see how the edge defined by EDSA and the private estates has already become more accessible and preferred over Manila's core way before the suburbanization and growth reached full swing in the 80s up to today. As foreshadowed by the Burnham Plan, fragmentation towards two separate areas continues. Quezon City to the new capital to the northeast, and Ayala's Makati, which is the new private edge city to the southeast. Just a close look now, you'll see that the core area has integration values of 1.3, 1.2, 1.28, but you'll see also that the integration of EDSA hits 1.43, 1.46, 1.45. So back in 1967, if you were lucky enough to own land along EDSA, you were already sitting at a gold mine just waiting to be tapped. You can also imagine how space and taps can be used in a similar way to predict where all these future prime land holdings could come up 50 years from now. Quezon City, envisioned to be a city for workers and the common tao, was planned ambitiously with monumental scale and grand roads. So the large blocks were supposed to house the compounds of various national government agencies. The irony is that instead of making government accessible to people, this effectively suburbanizes the city for cars and private and against pedestrians, creating segregated government enclaves as shown by the cool gradient on the pedestrian graph. This is another example of the difference between an imposed order versus the actual underlying structure. Next time you see a nice geometric pattern on a site or building plan, conscious that it could create something else from what was originally intended. Nice thing to point out for the mga tiga UP or alumni from the University of the Philippines is UP itself creates its own integration core. So no wonder why UP as a tightly knit community of intellectuals is it's a spatially and mechanically solid group of people, and the campus helps reach those relationships. This signals what is happening to the south, mirroring to the public housing in Quezon City. Ayala's Makati becomes Manila's first modern business district, planned around what used to be the Nielsen Airport's runways. This was then surrounded by gated villages catering to Manila's elite, which is Forbes Park, which is the first gated community. Parallel to Makati are similar privately developed edge cities like Araneta, Green Hills, and Ortigas. These sprang up to take advantage of the already higher spatial integration values. Today's Metro Manila sees the rise of these private edge cities. So all these colored zones, regions are edge cities. As night shift call centers turn them into 24/7 mixed-use CBDs. Similarly, privatization of government land creates vertical enclaves with new office and residential, retail, and amenity square footage. Inspecting these CBDs, the study finds that the aggregate accessibility values of these CBDs, shown as the red line in the graph, are not configured for pedestrians or local short distance movement from 400 meters to 1.2 kilometers. You see the white graph here is actually the integration values of the rest of the city. So it means that outside of the CBDs, Metro Manila is actually walkable. But inside the CBD is walkable. There's something interesting about this, so we'll expand on that later. This finding also finds that instead of pedestrian circulation, the CBDs actually prioritize vehicular circulation or high range movement from 2 kilometers to 5 kilometers onwards. This finding supports why EDSA is suffocated by vehicular traffic and why its vehicular capacity ratio has long been surpassed. This is also indicative of why we can walk within any of the CBDs. It's very hard to go from one side of Salcedo to Legazpi because the way the streets are configured, it's like a natural maze that you have to navigate and turn out of just to get to the other side. The dominance of these CBDs is confirmed by the clustering analysis of the commercial establishments and businesses. These include catering, F&B, retail services, and this shows how the biggest and hottest clusters of commercial activity form within the private CBDs. Outside of Metro Manila CBDs, these commercial establishments shown in the warm gradient are more accessible to surrounding streets. This shows that outside of the CBDs, all these commercial points tend to locate along pathways of natural movement. So if you're not a business within the CBD, your best bet is to locate along an accessible street, which is kind of common sense, because that's what natural movement is. But interestingly, within the CBDs, these commercial establishments shown in cool gradients have lower accessibility values. It means that if you're inside the CBD, you're not counting on street accessibility to pull people to you. This is anomalous to movement economies, and it's a sign of unnatural movement within the CBDs. This illustrates how inherently difficult it is to walk or commute to and within our CBDs. This is actually indicative of something bigger, which you can find in other examples of newer CBD developments around the world. Now, what comes out is there's a positive correlation between these business establishments within the CBDs and the size of their building footprints. So the more yellow a dot is, the larger the square footage of that building it's in. And you'll see that within the CBDs, the areas bordered in white, almost all the dots are yellow, whereas all the other dots outside of the CBDs are in the purple gradient. This points to how business establishments inside the CBDs are internalized within large floor plates, either in shopping malls, offices, parking podiums, garages, etc. These are all responses to the Philippine climate and to how real estate markets have privatized value capture and how the CBDs have configured for cars. This unnatural movement is inherently inaccessible, and it's a result of this privatized architectural and infrastructural enclosure of the city within its indoor environment. The interesting thing is this is a phenomenon you see in most modern CBDs. So even if you analyze Canary Wharf in London, or you go to the new, like for example, La Défense in Paris, these new business districts are usually not as accessible and instead rely on these large internalized floor plates to pull people in. Now, zooming out and looking at the building fabric of Metro Manila's core, you will see that the formal CBDs have big floor plates in yellow, while smaller building footprints in purple correlate with many informal settlements and slums. Looking at how the two colors intertwine, you will see that the working class seek to be nearby and populate very near our CBDs, and how the white boundaries of the CBDs effectively keep them out. This is why I say the CBDs are themselves enclaves, no different from the wall-less enclave of the Bayfront district, or even the walled enclave of Intramuros. This also calls attention to the fact that these CBDs cannot exist without the majority of the population, which is working class, to sustain and support their operations. Now, these CBDs are surrounded by gated exclusive villages, originally planned to keep post-war bandits and Cold War communist rebels out. They now secure their residents against prying eyes and kidnapping syndicates. This makes the gated village the de facto model of residential development for the working class outside of the core. In a way, it is a kind of trickle-down aspirational urbanism. If the rich want to be secure and exclusive, we also want the same for ourselves too. This study surveys perimeters of exclusive villages. So all of these white boundaries are all the existing gated villages. And then classifies their gates into 4 types with the corresponding colors. this creates a typology of access points and segregation that is not just present in Manila's elite exclusive villages, but in almost all kinds of subdivisions and housing projects all over the Philippines. So this suburbanization pattern has become the de facto pattern of development for our cities post-war. Now, if you were to average the accessibility values of all these streets within these villages, you will see that all of them have negative correlations to route choice and to integration. This quantifies just how segregated these exclusive villages are from the public network. So when people say it's an exclusive development, no, it's not. It's not just a brand, or it's not just a measure of, putting a nice logo and a nice salesperson or an artista to market it. Exclusivity is a spatial characteristic. It means it's really hard to get to in the first place. Yet, their village gates, so it's like an M&M. So the interior is soft and inaccessible, but the outer edge is hard and actually very accessible. So the village gates are all very highly correlated with vehicular accessibility. So you'll see that a much higher correlation with long-range access. It means that these villages are configured for vehicular movement and makes the air-conditioned bubble of a car preferable over walking to a nearby CBD. And this is kind of true, because if you happen to get stuck in Bel Air or Urdaneta, which are both walking distance to the Makati CBD, it is still more difficult to walk out than to just get on your car and drive out to the business district. Now, for the speculative experimental part of the study, with these findings, we aggregated the spatial networks and opened the villages to public traffic. So you will see that all the orange zones see an increase in accessibility and attraction. So what happens here is all the villages become more accessible, increasing their integration values, and thereby creating and inducing more movement into the villages. What happens is everywhere else, accessibility increases around the CBDs, but effectively the CBDs themselves get choked white. So literally, the CBDs are white. You don't see any increase in accessibility values. So the best comparison is when the Skyway was opened to Makati, it increased road capacity going to Makati. But because it did not increase road capacity or parking capacity within Makati, it created this logjam of cars going into and out of the CBD during the AM and PM rush hours. So opening village gates does the same. It increases road capacity into the CBDs, but actually only chokes and adds congestion within them. And these are the correlations. Opening the gates to the villages produces positive correlations within the for vehicular accessibility for CBDs and the villages. But as shown in blue, positive correlations also occur for walking distances. So you'll see here 800 meters, 1 kilometer, 1.2 kilometers. You also see an increase in accessibility. So this points to the potential for opening up these villages to pedestrian movement, pedestrian scale instead. Simulating this alternative, key villages light up in orange with higher values. And if you notice, these are smaller, more compact villages that are shallower from the public access roads. These characteristics aid in increasing the potential for these villages to become more pedestrian friendly. So these encircled villages are cases for further detailed inspection. The first case includes Green Hills and the Bel Air clusters. As seen in their street networks, these villages were originally planned to have open street grids. And these villages were eventually enclosed for security. Now, opening these streets, maybe with bollards and providing CCTV coverage, could be the start for creating a pedestrian-friendly redevelopment with shops and amenities for residents, allowing them to upzone and shift away from the low density, a car-centric mode of development. In cases with more introverted street layouts within the Valle de Belt, there are possibilities for limited redevelopment in the form of encircled yellow strips. These could be good for local shops, restaurants, and services for residents only. From this and the previous examples in Bel Air and Green Hills, you can see that there is a lot of nuance to opening access into villages. It is not simply opening gates to traffic. Space syntax as a set of methods is powerful in exposing these different centralities for different movement ranges. By seeing these centralities, we can plan and design with more nuance where and how we can pedestrianize, and where and how we can define higher densities, and where we can mix uses. The last case, Makati's Las Marinas Village, presents high pedestrian integration. So you can see the very high pedestrian integration. Even before I opened the gates, it was already very integrated because of the grid. Now, if you notice, it also has a very coarse grid of streets with large building footprints. All of their buildings are yellow. But these buildings are all houses. So this presents a tantalizing possibility. Given the earlier correlation between business establishments and large building footprints, could Las Marinas evolve to be a densified and more urbanized enclave that maintains exclusivity, similar to a mid-down Manhattan? Could it become more sustainable by reconfiguring for local pedestrian movement? The answer actually is, if you open the gates to this area and increase the zoning capacity, the spatial network actually pulls activity away from BGC. So in a way, the most natural extension of the Makati CBD is the Las Marinas and South Forbes and not BGC. But because of how land use restrictions and gates and of course, residents will not allow it to be so. No? That activity was shifted inward into BGC, which is actually a lot more inaccessible. So all these mentioned cases need further study and engagement with residents to rally collective self-interest and support. Now, I know this is like kicking a hornet's nest, a beehive, and a termite hill all at the same time, but this merely shows how much economic value and sustainability is being left on the table by their residents choosing to keep their gates up and maintaining village restrictions on land, which has become significantly more important over time. These areas point at the possibility for yellow field redevelopment, which is something that I'm proposing alongside the usual brownfield or industrial redevelopment and grayfield, which is suburban redevelopment. So maybe yellow field will be a new kind of redevelopment wherein single family residential areas are retrofitted and adjusted bottom up and up-zoned bottom up for the benefit of the village residents, so that they are less reliant on their own cars to access and get to amenities and activities. So to recap, spatial enclaves occur in Metro Manila's history in Intramuros, the Bayfront District, Quezon City, and Manila's edge cities. I think what's important to note is that enclaves are not necessarily a bad thing, a good or a bad thing, but the thing is, it's common in any society to want to enclose and protect one's social grouping. The nuance is, how big should these enclaves be? And how much permeability do we allow within a certain enclave to still make that enclave more livable and more urban, rather than these very sterile and inaccessible urban enclaves that we know. For question two, for research question two, Burnham City Beautiful Plan is romanticized, and the discourse about it just goes on forever. But the study reveals that it actually helps trigger the decentralization of Manila. The Burnham Plan became powerless because the original encomiendas outside of Manila re-emerge and privatize Manila suburbs. This shows the continuing struggle of government planners to regulate the interests of private estates and enclaves in the Philippines. For question three, Manila's enclaves are configured for cars. Within the enclaves themselves, business establishments are internalized within large building footprints, and this unnatural movement occurs as the privatized city becomes more architecturally and infrastructurally enclosed. Enclaves are not necessarily negative in Manila's climate of criminality and disorder, but the better question to ask is, how can these enclaves be reconfigured for walking? And what is the ideal walking range for a tropical climate? Lastly, for question 4, opening villages adds to Manila's road capacity, but also triggers induced vehicular demand, thus worsening traffic around Manila CBDs. And as an alternate proposal, the study unveils embedded potential within exclusive villages and actually our suburbs, all our suburbs, for yellow field redevelopment, a proposed new form of suburban pedestrianization. If you look at the rest of the urban fabric around the world, the global built environment is now seeing growth of more sprawling suburbs overtaking cities and downtown by land area. So yellow field redevelopment, I think, could be a new frontier in urbanism, and should be something that we should consider, because as oil and as a carbon-based lifestyles wane, we will have to reconfigure our built environment to be more livable and more sustainable. Now, moving forward, in the next set of slides, I will be discussing the concept of route choice centralities. The objective is to show how land use, distance of movement, and mode of transport and street layout are all interrelated and influence our lifestyle and built environment. I'll be analyzing southern Metro Manila, a largely suburban, car-centric cluster of cities that behaves as the first string of bedrooms for the workers of Makati and other CBDs. Although I'm not at liberty to share some of my consulting work because of NDAs, I will also be presenting case studies that present similar situations and ways forward for us. This shows the streets with the highest probability to be used as a route when traveling 5 kilometers or more. So you can see here that most of the white street networks are largely single-family residential gated villages. The warm streets are the primary arterial routes connecting these communities. And you will see Alabang Zapote Road and Dr. Santos or Sukat Road linking SLEX here to the right, and Naiya or Coastal Road up here to the left. These warm streets are the collector roads these interior orange streets are the collector roads that shortcut to these communities. And depending on land use and density restrictions, these warmest streets usually define the corridors for commercial use and activity in the suburbs. So in Las Piñas, most of the commercial activity happens along this Pine Road. Same for Sukat and Parañaque. And everything else is very residential and sterile. So businesses locate along them because of high traffic and visibility, clogging pass-through traffic with parking. So chances are this is also the condition wherein you can't really walk along the sidewalk because cars are parked on the sidewalk, because it's a car-oriented strip mall kind of development. It forces us to travel longer distances from our homes to be able to do anything in the suburbs. You'll see this pattern developing in Cavite, in Laguna, and in Bulacan. Now, to illustrate this further, I'd like to refer to some case studies published by the Princess Trust in the UK. This is the case of Chessington North, a modern garden city suburb outside of London. So the top diagram shows the land use figure ground diagram, showing the building use pattern similar to Metro Manila's southern suburbs, with deep residential areas, so the residential areas are yellow, bordered by commercial activity and malls along main roads. The bottom image shows the walkability of the neighborhoods, measured by the diversity of land uses accessible within a 400 meters walking radius from each building. And you can see by the cool gradient that the street pattern and land use distribution makes this area very car dependent, because for anyone inside these residential areas to get anywhere, it entails walking more than 400 meters out of their residential areas. So the cooler the gradient in the walkability diagram, the less walkable it is, because you have less land uses that you can get to within 400 meters. So take note of the rateable value here of the properties, which is about 1.2 million pounds, typical rateable value of this area. Contrast this to how another case, the area of Poundbury in Dorchester, was purposefully planned with smaller, secure residential neighborhoods. So you see that, yes, there's a lot of residential areas, but they created these tighter clusters, smaller enclaves, and created more permeable connectivity and land use. And you can see how walkability substantially shifts to warmer colors, signifying that one can reach more types of land uses within 400 meters of each building. So let's say in the warmer areas, in the yellow zone, no, you can actually access maybe 4 or 5 different land uses from where you are, from where you stay. This ability to access different land uses is itself the generator of pedestrian activity, even more so than having trees or parks and open spaces. Because ultimately, you know, the number of trips that you make to a park will never be more than the number of trips you have to go to the grocery, to the drugstore, or to a coffee shop. You will always be drawn to more commercial activities rather than open space. So because of this accessibility and permeability, you will also notice that there's a much higher rateable value for a property here. It's about 5.1 million pounds. This provides clues for us on how to plan new townships and settlements. Enclaves are not necessarily bad. We just need to configure them to be smaller to allow shallower access to different land uses and amenities. This also offers clues on how we can go back to our existing developments, our communities, to see how we can retrofit them and initiate a bottom-up yellow field redevelopment. Going back to Southern Metro, Manila, this shows the streets with the highest probability to be used as a route when walking 1.2 kilometers or cycling up to 2.5 kilometers. You can see that this network is more pervasive than the previous car-based network. And it's more pervasive and goes deeper into the wide streets or gated villages. What this means is that in terms of walkability, our existing residential subdivisions already have the potential to be more pedestrian and more livable. If properties along these local routes are allowed to construct slightly higher densities and provide commercial uses that are more compatible with the surrounding residential fabric, such as restaurants, coffee shops, small professional services and offices, commodity supply shops, healthcare, doctors' offices, and the like. These could also be the routes for village to point or point-to-point public transit to reduce car use. Now, concerns on the loss of security, peace and quiet, and harmony of residential surroundings can be addressed by reconstituting the wide streets into smaller, more compact and secure enclaves, and creating and enforcing stronger land use and design restrictions on these new active areas. In doing so, we make our villages more local, reducing the need to travel longer distances to do things, and maybe this will allow us to finally discover the conviviality of knowing our neighbors with whom we share our immediate and surrounding streets. I think even if we achieve some form of herd immunity, there are aspects of life that will no longer snap back to how they were before the pandemic. And working from home is teaching us how to live locally. So let us not squander the chance to retrofit our sterile and unhealthy suburbia into these new forms of urban villages. This ends my presentation. I hope we can work together to change how the markets value gated enclaves. There's no either or in creating more livable environments. And analytical evidence-based methods like space impacts allow us to illustrate these nuances that allow us to, again, think in terms of human scale, even at the metropolitan level. Thank you for your time. Salamat.
Thank you, Lian, for that very insightful presentation. So now we would actually open this up for the audience for questions. I think, John, you could start because you've been writing your question on the side.
Yes. So I was wondering what are sort of the challenges for like local government planners when they wish to apply this kinds of rational planning methods, in their everyday work.
Well, I think there's always this, there's always this, syempre, there's always this doubt. No? So I think the challenge is how do we communicate well enough to the stakeholders or to the decision makers that it's actually in their interest to change things marginally. So I guess what we need is the chance to create a proof of concept, at least on a small scale. Like maybe identifying a certain street segment now, okay, let's urbanize this, let's turn this into more pedestrianized. Maybe we can draw, or maybe we open a gate here or there, and create that proof of concept. And from there, you can build a case now, hey, it's working, and we can move on. Actually, the funny thing is, you don't really need to look far because developers are already doing that. You know, Bonifacio High Street is a model of a street. Bonifacio High Street is a mall that distills the lessons of a high street in a regular city, and then condenses it into and crystallizes it into a nice, privatized, clean setting. So if you're able to create a business improvement district, or create an area that has elements of this, that doesn't necessarily have to be of the same scale, then maybe we can swing it. The challenge is really communicating and sparking the imagination of our stakeholders.
Okay. Just a follow from that, like when you mentioned like high street, what sort of like reminds me is like it sort of like has a sort of lack of like an economic mix of like people, because like for example, like more working class people would like be more located like outside of that like areas. I was wondering if that has any effect on the outcomes, or is it just going to be like the model is just going to be somewhat of a like very middle class upper kind of urbanism?
Okay, I think the question is related to gentrification. No?
Yeah.
I think gentrification is bad if there's a turnover of the existing resident population with a new resident population that is more well off. So it, in a way, it evicts people from the city, right? But in the cases of private gentrification, like for example, if you were to gentrify a yellow field or an existing residential village or subdivision, you're not necessarily kicking residents out. You're actually empowering them to stay in the area and profit from their position in that area. So instead of becoming marginalized by prices, they stand to benefit by turning their ground floors into leasable space, or densifying into up higher buildings. Maybe instead of a single or two-floor structure, two-floor house, they can go 3 or 4 floors as a townhouse, and have the ground floor as a retail commercial space, and they move upstairs. So it's moving on from a sterile single-use land use template and adapting the territory for their own uses. It's, in a way, it's creating that talipapa, or that working class market street environment, but allowing it to permeate the more exclusive residential villages. So I don't see any risk of evicting any existing residential population unless you start really evicting real people in informal settlements. It's a different matter. So yellow field redevelopment is different from urban redevelopment, because the connotations of urban redevelopment it's very loaded with a lot of negative connotations, because it means you're gonna have to kick people out. Diba?
Yeah, thank you.
I think
Audrey,
I also have just a follow-up regarding that question of yours, John. I'm just wondering, Leon, because beside the governance changes and of course some planning modifications that we need to do in our structure, wouldn't this also require massive cultural change to open up, considering the stigma between different classes, not just between, enclaves to CBD, but also enclaves to other settlements?
Yeah.
Just wonder, what are your thoughts?
Yes. I think it's a marketing and PR, it's a values issue, because maybe more than marketing and PR, it's about values. I guess we have to accept that there is always elitism in any social environment or context. No? But what we need to kind of rediscover as Filipinos is, hey, at least amongst neighbors, amongst the well-off, within a certain territory, they themselves don't know each other. And why is that? Because they don't walk, they don't encounter each other on the streets. They only encounter each other when they back out of their driveways and rush off to work. So I think amongst the wealthy within the suburban context, the middle class within the suburban context, there's an opportunity there to create that conviviality. Now, we may not be able to do it well for the existing, it's very hard to change mindsets for the existing communities like what I mentioned, no? Like Forbes and San Juan and Green Hills and Bel Air. But newer projects that I'm encountering, and even newer projects that I'm seeing around the region, are integrating some of these lessons. They're becoming less deep, and you'll see neighborhoods or enclaves that are smaller and more compact. And that creates this different lifestyle that I think if people start seeing the benefits of, they will aspire to that as well. It becomes another problem of creating that case study that people will say, hey, I want that for myself too. The problem is wala pang infiltration ng ganung values dun sa developers and sa planners and designers, because we haven't had those options yet. I guess there's so much inertia from doing things the way they were always done. So it's really about educating and learning how to do it, teaching the methods and how to do it moving forward. So, I've had some consulting cases. I've been working as a spatial analysis consultant for 3 other projects that are testing out these ideas. So far naman it's successful. The only challenge is introducing these analytical methods changes the pace of consulting, because before you work off intuition, you work off the skills that you practice in design studio, diba? When you're in planning or architecture studio, you are kind of trained to work off your intuition and your creative gut instinct. Whereas using evidence and analytical methods, you kind of have to press pause on your gut instinct. So you make an assumption, and then you have to run it and test it first. And then you're seeing the results, and then you're like, oh, okay, so we need to tweak it. We need to adjust it. And by adjusting it, then you are now using the evidence, instead of using evidence to justify your gut instinct, which is also kind of regressive. Sayang yung evidence.
So yes, pursuing for a more evidence-based planning naman is one of the key ways we could introduce this really. I have another question from a colleague of mine, Gunali. So she wanted to know, she's not from Manila, but she did a studio a year ago in Metro Manila. And one of her questions is like, what do you think are the limitations of using space syntax in the context of Metro Manila in terms of, let's say, not sure, data gathering or the availability of this data, or let's say how it also does it limit the viewpoint of the informalities that currently exist in our cities.
Also, sorry, just to add to that, like I was wondering if it will also ignores like things like infrastructure, like public transportation as well. 'Cause that's also quite a big factor for accessibility.
Yep, good questions. to be honest, because first of all, because Metro Manila doesn't have very good public transport, so our spatial network is really weighted towards roads. And because it's weighted towards roads, space syntax is perfect for that. Second, because there's also not much available big data unless you make use of the Google APIs or you have access to the Grab API or internal data sets from these big tech companies. There's not much data out in the wild. So you're gonna have to rely on the network latent data, which is on the spatial network itself, and available mapping, or building your own spatial network yourself by observing and tracing the actual new maps. The very obvious limitation is informality. That's right, because if you look at how informality forms, the fine grain of informality doesn't get mapped in OpenStreetMap or in any GIS database. It's usually just a region. Like, for example, if you look at an informal settlement, it's usually just a region with the entrance defined. But like, for example, getting into Baseco, you just see the key routes inside Baseco. But I'm sure within Baseco itself, there's a finer grain of access. The interesting thing is, Space Syntax has had enough decades of research to map and to create a method for informality. The challenge is having enough time and eyeballs on the ground to actually map the informality. But my professors at UCL have actually mapped informality in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, and a few other locations. The interesting thing is they found that because amongst the migrant communities in Saudi, there are Hindus and there are Muslims, and they have the separate spatial networks within these informal settlements. It's just that they had to go in and really map it. So that's the difficult part. You have to go in, but then the method is there. So the challenge, as always, is the wherewithal and the funding to do the mapping and the analysis. Now, related to the transport networks, there's also enough evidence to indicate how new transport stops or new stations and two-way accessibility. The interesting thing is, Space Syntax also tends to point at future problem transport stops. For example, if you open a transport stop in a naturally accessible area, it just becomes stronger because you're magnifying and you're amplifying the network around it because it's very accessible. But if you put a transport stop, subway stop, say in some place less accessible, no amount of promotion or feeder routes will increase footfall capacity into that area because the network itself doesn't allow access into it. So in a way, the street network is still a very fundamental layer that can mean the success or failure of these new transport stations. The tricky thing here is this: our rush to build infrastructure here in the Philippines is seeing new train lines going up to Clark, and all along the path, you see new stations. I've had the chance to, study one of these station sites. I will not disclose. And you will see the problem is that in some areas, the stations are not really accessible and are not geared towards allowing people, more pedestrians, to access these stations. So the question now is, okay, yes, we're introducing a lot of this infrastructure, which is great. But the next step of reconfiguring the built area around this infrastructure, we're failing to do. And because government is kind of just happy to get the infrastructure done, the value capture opportunities of these properties surrounding the new infrastructure is lost to the private sector. So government is losing the wherewithal or the ability to create the value capture for itself, which is similar to what we're seeing on EDSA. I mean, what we saw on EDSA. diba? When EDSA was completed, all the other owners already had that position, their positions in place, and they were the ones who took advantage, who were able to maximize the value capture of EDSA. So I think, not to big up space and tax, but I think there's a lot of there's the only weakness is time and resources. But there's a fundamental strength in its methods, because it's a bottom-up method rather than a heavy-handed, tech-reliant method of reading and watching sensors and disturbing everyone's privacy. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question from the audience here. Let me just read that out. So a question from Lance, and I think same from Elson, which are very similar and regarding to the yellow field development. So even if we open gates, even if opening the gates will just clog existing CBDs, can they be a first step towards yellow field development? And then another question is, can yellow redevelopment of existing subdivision villages be done using homeowners resolution or board approval, or the still needs DHUSD approval to change zoning existing subdivision? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Actually, we cannot force change on people. As much as we'd like to, change the context in a blink of an eye, it would be very difficult. I think what we need to highlight always is quality of life. If we communicate to villagers in the south that, look, your community is lived in well enough, you have enough people to sustain maybe a row of shops in an accessible segment, like on the main street or facing the park, something like that. These vacant lots here, we will convert this as a possible coffee shop, botica, or convenience store that people can cycle to without bringing their cars. And we will police and we will manage it so that people don't just throw their trash on the side. They themselves will say, yeah, I'd like that. I don't want to go out anymore, especially with the quarantine, with the pandemic lockdowns. I think people started realizing, oh shoot, I can't get anything from where I live. Can you imagine if you live in any of those new suburbs in Cavite or Laguna that you have to travel 1 to 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers into the village? When the lockdowns came up, and I'm not saying we will never have another pandemic. There's a strong chance that these lockdowns will keep coming back. Lee Hsien Loong, the PM of Singapore, just announced that we have to learn how to live with lockdowns. So in a way, it's doing people a favor. You have to communicate that we're actually giving them a better option, a better kind of livability by having these certain community-oriented uses available to them close by. And then they will start saying, hey, this is good. This has benefited our community. Maybe we can expand a little bit. Maybe we can have laundromats. Maybe we could have doctors' offices and things like that. The heart of this is the permissive zoning methods that the Japanese have. So when you say a residential district, the Japanese actually allow a lot of things within the residential district framework. It allows you to open up a store in your garage, as long as you're not, you comply with the sanitation and health and safety requirements. So, yeah, I think we cannot force change onto people, but maybe the new department of housing and human settlements might be able to kind of nudge people like, okay, for all your local trips, you don't need to go out anymore. Maybe we will encourage people, village associations to set this up. Don't need to use the power of the state to compel people to do things, because I think at the end of the day, people will see the value in these changes.
Thanks, Ian. I think Roden has a question. Roden, would just like to speak to that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, first of all, Leon, thanks for your time and thanks for sharing this very interesting research with us, CERN. My question is related to the issue of informality, and I saw that the enclaves that you've mentioned here, most of these enclaves are actually close to informal settlements where a lot of our cheap labor, the settlements that are residents of most of our labor force in Metro Manila. My colleague at Unimelb, Professor Kim Doby, has been mapping some of the informal settlements in, I think now they're mapping 50 cities. One of those cities is Metro Manila. Now, I was just wondering how we can harness the potential of space syntax to basically amplify the interface between the formal urban development and informal settlement, which is actually home to a lot of our urban labor force that is also driving the city. I mean, it's not just home for the poor, it's really the source of our productive labor force. Is there a space within space syntax to harness that formal informal interface?
That's a great question. I think the fact that there's so much informality surrounding our CBDs is in fact a very obvious indication that these CBDs cannot exist without the workers, without the masses of workers that support them. From there, we have to move away from space syntax. I think it becomes a different issue altogether. Kasi, space syntax can only do so much, like mapping and hinting about possible intervention. But to me, kasi maybe this is my Singapore training speaking, informal settlements are there because there's demand. So the question now is, how do we make these informal settlements more livable while at the same time scaling up the solutions of our housing for the housing shortage that we have in Metro Manila? And space syntax doesn't have a solution for that. I think my straight answer is we need a stronger housing regime that doesn't kick people out outside of Metro Manila. Kasi our current housing model is, okay, we have these people here that we need to resettle. Sorry guys, we're gonna move you out of Metro Manila. And you're gonna have to commute to Metro Manila now. And then people are gonna be like short-handed because they'll be moved out into the boonies without any access and without any amenities. Whereas places like Singapore took pains in saying, okay, first we'll inventory everybody here. We'll cap, okay, everybody that's existing here. We'll take an inventory. We'll try to carve out tactically some vacant land, and then we'll start building a vertical housing typology. And then we'll slowly, piece by piece, relocate people into these housing typologies in city so that they're not so far off from where they were staying. And that now actually contributes tremendously to the vibrancy of the existing CBDs, because you're not taking people away, you're actually improving their living conditions. Now, I know that the odd thing is, design studios like fetishizing poverty, like fetishizing informality. Pero I'm a little bit heavy-handed when it comes to solutions like that and problems like this, because we need solutions at scale. And we cannot propose nice, cute little huts that stack on top of each other, not 2 floors, 3 floors, because it's still the same density problem. We need to create proper housing blocks that are amenitized and that work for our informal settlers. In the absence of that, we're just kicking the can along. I mean, further down. We're not really solving the problem. So maybe I'm wrong because my mindset is too can do, but Why can't we? So I think that's where space in tax kind of falters a little bit, because it's no longer about space per se. It's about intent. What is our intent when it comes to solving the in-city housing problem that we obviously have, diba? So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks, Leon.
just following up from that, I was wondering in like new developments where you have like operation but with for value capture that government just lets go. Are there ways to like convince government, you think, to capture those, even to like get those like get some of that like value capture for like those stronger housing regimes, just to not create more of like the same thing that's been plaguing like this what's within our city.
That's the Burnham problem again, because chances are these territories that are along the alignments of transit are actually owned by government leaders.
Yep.
Themselves,
So it,
or by powerful families already. So you know, the value factor is already there, but by private individuals who happen to be in power also.
so there's becomes like a just a big conflict of interest, if anything.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to address lang the question here, no, from Dale. Are there promising case studies in PH which township developers can look to for being vibrant, competitive, with a high quality of life, trendsetter? To be honest, the best we can do are the existing CBDs like the BGC, and because that's what we see. Pero we know we could do better, because BGC itself is not the exemplar of access and equitability to more people. I think the interesting thing is there are a lot more promising case studies for township development outside of the Philippines, around the ASEAN region. To me, that's very eye-opening, because what Singapore developers are doing, exporting the Singapore model elsewhere, we're falling behind. Actually, Filipino developers are falling behind, because we seem to be calling plays off the same playbook from the 50s. We're not calling plays from a newer playbook, which the Singaporeans have been perfecting in their township development, in their new developments elsewhere. So it's a bit of a blank space. The Philippines is still a blank space for these new trendsetter townships. Maybe we could work together and find a client to craft something for them. So yeah.
I think we'll just go for the last question because we basically over time. Last question is from Jay Paras. So this is going back to space syntax. Does space syntax support or promote form-based zoning, or can it also simulate planning scenarios?
Yeah, actually, just to address Jay and Mr. David Yap's comments. Actually, if you flip the equation, normally kasi planners think in terms of land use. Land use first, and then network second. But if you flip it around, you start with the network first and allocate land use based on the network. That's already a paradigm shift in how to do your planning. So if I were to use space and tax in form-based zoning, I would craft more density and more urban scale where I have the highest integration values. All the areas in red, I would upscale to high density. So if you think in terms of a graph, if you have a high scale road here, your density starts cascading down the further away you are from that high integration area. So yes, space and tax is perfect for form-based land use, form-based zoning. and to simulate planning scenarios. That's exactly what I do right now. It's exactly what I'm trying to carve out. Regarding Bill Hillier, actually, Space and Tax has moved on and grown from leaps and bounds from Bill Hillier's original days. It's no longer just about connectivity. There has been enough studies. If you go through the Space and Tax network of research, it's not just about connectivity anymore. There's so many overlays of social and economic behaviors, health outcomes, obesity patterns, access to food and access to healthcare, even vaccination zones, even density of greenery, even visibility and spatial networks at night. So they're able to map certain segments of a street network which are the best lit at night, and then they're able to compare with what segments of the network are most connected at day. They're able to create a city at night and a city at day scenario, and it's very telling how our cities change. Pag umaga, there are certain areas that are accessible, there are certain areas that are not at night, and it's a guide to further interventions. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Yes, connectivity is the limit of Space and Tax, but when you see how scholars have and practitioners have overlaid so many different correlates on connectivity, you start realizing, okay, this is a very powerful method. So yeah, National Land Use Act solved the bottleneck of issuing land value capture being equitable. Yes, if it gets passed. Sorry, Jay. not to be cynical, but you know, it's been in Congress for some time, so it just has to get passed. Nelson Piano. Sorry, may pahabol pa. Is it possible that Space and Tax be incorporated in traffic impact assessment during development planning? Yes. Actually, the way it's practiced in London by Space and Tax Limited, which is the spin-off company of the professors that taught us at UCL, they actually work with traffic consultants. So they blend the network connectivity and the gravity based methods of traffic simulation to weigh the model. So it's possible. It's possible to combine. It's just that we haven't had the chance to do it here yet. Pero marami ng opportunities abroad. I guess there's no other questions.
Yep. So just to mention to everyone that this, especially those who come in late, that this session is recorded. So just let us know if you have like any concerns with that, and this will be uploaded to like our YouTube page. Thank you, Audrey.
So I think we'll be closing the session now, because we've gone beyond our usual time of 1 hour and a half. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Feel free to stay, I guess, if you still want to chat informally, but we're closing officially the event. And thank you again, Leon, for giving us the presentation today. It's very insightful, also the methodology of space syntax and also your study about Manila. Thanks. Have a good evening.
Salamat.
Yes,
Salamat,
thank you,
salamat.
Leon. We appreciate it. Thank you.